There are two things we learn from Upanishads. Number one, the worship of 33 koti devata. And number two, it's an observation that generally one can break God's commandment if one has energy to do so. And generally one cannot follow God's commandment if one doesn't have energy to do so. And this is coming from Upanishad. So, did Vivekananda explain and employ these fundamental things? And this is a question for all scholars.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I did not need a synopsis of the question. I'm sorry, I did not follow the question myself.
No, are you asking if there's a proposition in the Upanishads that Vivekananda can explain? Is that what you're asking?
There are two things we learn from Upanishads. One is worship of 33 koti devata. You heard me? Did Vivekananda explain and employ this?
Yeah, see, this will get us into the theological sides that I am not competent to discuss. But what I will say is, Vedana. There are many books, but Vedanta is a book on what we call Vedantic cosmology. It's an extremely interesting discussion of these kind of questions. What the relationship between the devatas, the Trishkoti devatas, and tied the Brahman, the absolute. This obviously concerned Vivekananda from his college days. I mean, when he was in college, he used to discuss with Brajendranath Seal, who became later a famous philosopher, whether the Hindu idea of the Brahman and Hegel's absolute spirit were the same thing. So, and he has many things to say about it. The position in which he could both accommodate Shankara's idea of Advaita Vedanta and Ramakrishna's idea of actually worshipping Kali in a particular form without falling into Vishishtadvaita philosophy. But these are deeply philosophical questions that I am historical. So I don't think I can go into the complexities of philosophical problems, but I think he deals with these sorts of questions. Tetrish Koti or even 1 crore, I mean, he deals with the relationship between devtas in particular forms, or devis in particular forms, and the absolute.
Thanks for the lecture. I have a question for Professor Anniv. So this is related to Swami Vivekananda's lecture at the World Parliament of Religions back in 1883. In one of his lectures, he mentioned something about the downfall of India has to do with the separation of Buddhism from Hinduism. He mentions about how the brain aspect of Buddhism was the Brahmitra at that point, and by separating them, India lost a big time. And that was the cause of the poverty, and he used the word 300 million beggars. In that. And he also talks about how Buddhism actually also lacked the brain aspect of it, whereas Hinduism lacked the heart aspect of it, and that was the downfall of Hinduism. So I didn't exactly understand this question, understand this statement very well. I understood it from a non-academic point of view. If you drive away someone like a Gautama Buddha, so obviously what comes back is not something very good. But from an academic point of view, what is the understanding of the background behind this statement from Swami Vivekananda?
It's a really interesting question, and an unusual one. I agree that he was obsessed with this thing about the head and the heart. And he was speaking not only about the historical reality where he felt that Buddhism had been corrupted historically after its arrival in India, and that Shankara and Hinduism was necessary to bring back a potent theology that was focused on Brahman and got realization. But what he really wanted was the reunion of the head and the heart that he saw as Buddha's compassion. And there was an instrumental dimension to that part of what he was saying in the Parliament, which was that Buddhism was much more well known in America at the time than Hinduism. And it was well known through the great poem about the Buddha. The Light of Asia, which became, for Christians who were losing their faith, a kind of form of neo-Christianity almost. It's hard to explain, but it's true. There was these foundational figures, Christ and Buddha. And instead, what was needed was trying to convey a sense of Hinduism, which had so many different schools and was so philosophically complex. It was almost impossible to explain this to Westerners. So he was saying that the ethics of the Buddha, which for many people in the Parliament was like the ethics of Christianity because of his emphasis on compassion. But I don't want to suggest that it was simply instrumentalism or transactionalism. He was also, I think, this is my personal view, dealing with something that was profound in him, which was what Dipesh said. The criticism of Shankara, which he made as a young sannyasi, was that he rejected the poor, the subaltern, the Shudra, and also the untouchable, that anyone should be able to know the wisdom, and that it was only through worshiping the poor and worshiping everyone that the Buddha had understood that Hinduism itself, in its contemporary form, could be revitalized. So, does that help you? Yeah.
One more question.
I have a very practical, modern question. Actually, two questions combined. So, Vivekananda talked about, universal respect for different religions, and today we have these wars going on in different theaters all across the globe. Russia, Ukraine, and then Israel, Palestine, and then Southeast Asia, even off South China Seas, there's tensions building. But anyway, so how do we get across this lesson? But it's more complicated than that, because that's just a smokescreen, because behind it there are economic and political motives, to acquire land with resources. We want to follow Vivekananda's lesson, make the world a better place with mutual respect. How do we address these conflicts? Secondly, there's the role of technology. We have all these wonderful technologies coming out, AI, quantum computing, and that leads kind of to a scientific confirmation of the philosophy of Advaita, the universal consciousness. But at the same time, there are ethical problems because governments are using the technology to spy on everyone. So if you want to speak out against things like the wars, whatever, you can be silenced because of the technology. So there's kind of two questions in one. These political conflicts and how do we navigate proper ethics in this new age of AI and artificial intelligence? If you have any thoughts in keeping in tune with Vivekananda's visions and ideas.
I'm going to let Dipesh start so I can think what I want to say about this. I think he wouldn't have necessarily seen AI as promoting universal consciousness. I think he would have wondered whether or not it was possible, whether there was a danger that it actually might obstruct the kind of self-realization and thought. But I'll let you speak.
No, not elaborate wisdom. I'm in a part of the world where AI is being developed and advanced. But when sometimes I used to hear about people talking about self-driving cars, and self-driving cars coming across ethical problems, like the car may be programmed to protect the rider. And let's say the car faces a choice between hitting a child and hitting a tree, and hitting the child might mean protecting the driver. How would it resolve that kind of ethical problem? My sense is that, at least in its present stage of development, AI would not feel anguish. It would work according to the algorithm, and it might even debate it. But a human being has the capacity to feel anguish over something. And I don't see AI actually at that stage where it would actually feel anguish. And in that sense, what I hear in your question is precisely the anguish about the state of the world we're in with all those wars. And it's that, I think the question is addressed to a human being. The rhetoric of appealing to a human being would partly be the rhetoric of appealing to the anguish.
I would just say, just to add to that, Mark Zuckerberg, there's the new glasses, and you can have everything on the glasses. And he also said, we won't be friends anymore. And I think that this relates to, again, the question of head and heart, that despite the possible, quote, mistakes that the heart might make, Vivekananda would nonetheless argue, again, if we go back to him, that without that possibility of the relational, that it's very hard to discuss ethics, because it is an algorithm in the end.
Just last point is that, of course you need good messages to go out, but obviously, as you know, world events are not changed by messages alone. There have to be other factors. The interesting thing I find in talking about Vivekananda's legacy is the actual living legacy in living human beings. That Nivedita's struggle to relate to Hinduism and Hindu practices she didn't like initially, is part of her own evolution. And similarly, Gopalarma underwent some transformation. And it's this juxtaposition of these two transformations which are not identical. That's what speaks to the complex story of how humans become ethical in situations they sometimes half understand.
I'd just like to end by just responding to that, just to respond, which is that what happens when there's a gulf of understanding? And of course, we're living, I think you're quite right. You began with a list of the conflicts. And how do we keep in our heads two things at once? I spoke about this a little bit earlier, that we're in a position to talk about political interests or to what we think we need as a country or a group, but in fact, how do you keep the other person in view or the other system in view? And this is what's lost without this idea. One of the things about the example that Dipesh gave was that Nivedita did not transform herself. She just learned more about the tradition that she comes from. And that is I think in many ways, the essence of Vivekananda's message. And it goes beyond the philosophy of Advaita. It is part of it, but it isn't just that. Please join me in thanking
Thank you so much. And again, my apologies for us running about 10 minutes behind time. Although it's not my honor to introduce Professor Chris Chapple and Professor Rita Sharma, I do get to say a few words about Professor of Sanskrit Luther Obrock. I've known Professor Obrock for almost 17 years now, first as a graduate student at Berkeley and now as a colleague. I still recall one of my first encounters with him. He was auditing a class focused on religious nationalism in South Asia, and I remember wondering at the time, why in the world is a Sanskritist interested in the 19th and 20th century? I did not compute, because my experience of most of the Sanskritists in my department was that they were philologists, and that time came to an end in the 3rd century AD. Well, let me just say, it is precisely the fact that Professor Obrock is an atypical Sanskritist that has resulted in all sorts of honors being bestowed upon him, including his hire as a lecturer of Sanskrit at the University of Pennsylvania. This was then followed by an assistant professorship at the University of Toronto. In 2021, he spent a year at the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton University before he returned to UC Berkeley as an assistant professor in Sanskrit language and literature. Professor Obrock has won many honors, fellowships over his career. He's also the co-author, editor of a couple of books, namely Oriel Stein's Illustrated Raja Tarangini and Bhattuji Dikshita on the Gaja Sutra. Both these books were published in 2013. What we're really interested in, me specifically, but some of his colleagues too, is his forthcoming monograph, focused on Sanskrit-based literary histories of Kashmir from the 12th century through the 16th century. On that note, and without much further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Obrock to the podium.
I have to say, I wasn't expecting to get introduced, so I'm blushing a little bit, but it's my great pleasure to introduce the two people that we really want to hear talk right now. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Christopher Chapple, who is the Doshi Professor of Indic Studies at Loyola Marymount University. He's an expert on yoga traditions, and yoga traditions kind of really thought about broadly in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. He's the author of numerous books about yoga practice, yoga and philosophy, and it's also what I really like is kind of yoga and ecology, thinking about non-human and animal agents, thinking about kind of a very broad and expansive world to think through yoga. And his latest book is in that tradition, especially the kind of ecological tradition called Living Landscapes, Meditations on the Elements in Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain yoga. I think about 2020? Yeah, I actually remember these things. And also I was very excited because we were just talking earlier, he has a book of translations come out of a career of working on these, which will be coming out shortly, looking at yoga texts from the early yoga tradition. So I'm really looking forward to that. Our other speaker is Professor Rita Sharma, who's the director of the GTU Center for Dharma Studies. And before this, she was the Vivekananda Chair at the University of Southern California. And she's the author of numerous publications about Hindu religion, theology, philosophy, and practice. But really important for us here today, and really exciting for us here today, is she's the editor of a poem about Swami Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda, his life, legacy, and liberative ethics. So I'm really excited to welcome them both to this, both to the stage here, and we'll hear them speak and have a conversation together. So thank you very much.
I invite everybody to remember you have a body, and to please, if you are able to stand. And look down on Mother Earth, the place of Bhudevi. I'm going to share from Raja Yoga a few words. revise them a little bit. He says sit, but I'll say stand in a straight posture, what the Jains call kayotsarga. Let your body rise up from the earth. The next thing to do is to send a current of holy thought to all creation. Mentally repeat what we heard earlier from the Swamis. Let all beings be happy. Let all beings be peaceful. Let all beings be blissful. So do to the east. Now, turn a quarter to the right, to the south, and then turn a full 180 degrees to the north, and then facing out toward the street to the west. Happy, peaceful, blissful. If you can face east again, please. The more you practice this, the better you will feel. You will find at last that the easiest way to make ourselves healthy is to see that others are healthy. The easiest way to make ourselves happy is to see that others are happy. After doing that, those who believe in God should pray, not for money, not for health, not for heaven. Pray for knowledge and light. The next thing to do is to think that your body is firm, strong, and healthy, for it is the best instrument you have. So please sit down again. And I want to share just a little bit of information about Boston and the birthplace of Christian Science, the landing spot not only for Swami Vivekananda, but also for Paramahansa Yogananda. Science and Health. The root text for Christian Science originally quoted liberally from the Upanishads. And undoubtedly, Swami Vivekananda was well familiar with that version, which was later redacted, the Upanishads removed. But as we think of the Upanishads, where do they begin and end? They begin and end with breath. Again and again, they remind us of our positionality, the east, the west, the south, the north. And what Swami Vivekananda presented was, as that photograph that was shared earlier so beautifully reminded us, was that he was inviting people to re-inhabit the body, inviting people to clarify all confusion, to dispel ignorance. And what he called people to do was to find that place of yoga, that place of connection. And although I don't have a fancy PowerPoint, I did want to share my 1 rupee ticket. My first trip to India in 1981, boarded that boat, crossed that choppy sea to Vivekananda Rock, and for him, it was that moment on that rock that he decided to go to Boston, to Chicago. And for me, as a 25-year-old at a World Religions Conference, it was encouragement that although the journey may be long, beauty can emerge. So I want to just give honor to what Swami Vivekananda inspired throughout the world and be grateful that we're able to still gather literally in his name and in his memory. So thank you. I now hand this to my wonderful colleague.